In the red-hot box office battle of the summer of 1984, a star-free, modestly budgeted martial arts story crane-kicked its way into pop culture history, becoming the underdog success story of the year and delivering some of the most iconic moments in 80s cinema. From there, the Karate Kid transformed into a full-blown Hollywood dynasty, spawning a dojo-sized selection of sequels and reboots. And now, the series is preparing for another cruel summer on the big screen. But did any of those follow-ups over the decades come close to reclaiming former glories? As Hollywood went karate crazy in the wake of the Kid's success, could any of the countless martial arts wannabes even survive the first round? And did a scrappy streaming series secretly hold the blueprint for long-term success all along?
Mercy is for the weak, Todd!
Sweep the leg, wax off and step back onto the mat. This is Sequelpalooza. Our story begins in early 1977. A low-budget boxing drama, written by and starring Sylvester Stallone, has begun its journey to becoming a worldwide movie sensation. Rocky opened in North America in December of 1976 to largely positive reviews but enormous box office, and is now gradually delivering similar results across the globe. It would go on to become one of the most iconic films of the generation. Both the movie's making and success reflected the rags to riches story it told. The film, produced for a little under $1 million, with Stallone having to fight to play the role he had written, would go on to make $225 million in cinemas. If my calculations are correct, that's more than a 22,000% increase on investment. Rocky was not only an absolute triumph for Sly Stallone, but also for its director, John Avildsen. Though Avildsen had directed a number of films already, the pop culture kaboom of Rocky was on an entirely new level. Winning both Best Director and Best Picture at the 1977 Oscars, Avildsen was now a made man in Hollywood. He could essentially do whatever he wanted next, cash in his chips for his dream project, or even take on the inevitable Rocky II first. The world was quite literally his oyster. So what major project did the director of such a huge movie choose from the smorgasbord of productions that lay in front of him? Well, of course, he made a romantic drama with lots of dance routines about a New York City newspaper columnist who falls in love with a terminally ill ballerina. Obviously. Slow Dancing in the Big City arrived in cinemas in November of 1978 and went absolutely nowhere, making less than $2 million in cinemas, and with his direction, much like the script, receiving generally negative reviews. The momentum Avildsen had created was washed away fairly rapidly. Years later, he would admit regret about not taking the Rocky II job and confess that he only made Slow Dancing because he was in love with writer Barra Grant. The thing was though, in the following years, Avildsen's heart-first career move looked like it might derail things more permanently. 1980's The Formula, starring Marlon Brando, crash-landed at the box office, and 1981's Neighbours, starring John Belushi and Dan Aykroyd, suffered through a painful production process, during which the director argued with almost everyone, not least his two stars, who lobbied to have him removed from the picture. Avildsen himself said about 1983's unsuccessful A Night in Heaven, "It was really terrible. I knew it, I have absolutely no defense for it. I'd almost be willing to give people their money back. Things were a little messy now for the once golden boy director." But Hollywood loves an underdog story. Before too long, Avildsen was approached by Rocky producer Jerry Weintraub to make a movie far closer to his big hit. It was the story of Daniel LaRusso, a New Jersey teenager being bullied in his new home of LA, who is taught both karate and life lessons from an unassuming handyman called Mr. Miyagi, as he prepares to face his adversary Johnny Lawrence from the Cobra Kai dojo in the All Valley Under-18 Karate Championship. a semi-autobiographical script written by newcomer Robert Mark Kamen when he was asked by Weintraub to create a martial arts story like Rocky, but not too much like Rocky. The Karate Kid had been inspired by a news story of a young boy who had asked to go to karate school to learn to defend himself from bullies at school. Kamen understood this story incredibly well. He had essentially lived it. At age 17, he had been beaten up by a group of bullies, started learning karate from a tough Cobra Kai style teacher, but instead gravitated towards being taught by a philosophical man named Miyagi, the same name he used for his script. Kamen blended the two schools of teaching, added in other personal experiences like the climactic karate tournament, and incorporated Hollywood elements such as a love story with Elizabeth Shue's Ali. As Kamen put it himself, the movie is basically a dramatization of my own experience. Producer Weintraub reached out to Avildsen directly because of their Rocky success together. He had proven he could combine the visceral excitement of sporting moments with personal struggles in an uplifting, sincere tone that landed perfectly with audiences. It was such a close descendant of the Stallone smash hit that it wasn't uncommon to hear it referred to as the Karate Kid. When it came to casting, Avildsen fought the studio to make sure that Niriyuki Pat Morita could play the pivotal Miyagi role. It's hard to imagine, but there is a world in which Mr. Miyagi is played by anyone else. Columbia Pictures and producer Weintraub were hesitant to cast Morita, given that he was known as a comedian at this stage. He played a recurring role as Arnold in Happy Days and started his career in stand-up. His casting didn't make much sense, but Avildsen saw the vision. He filmed Morita's audition, showed it to Weintraub, and the producer cried as he said, "That is Mr. Miyagi." Numerous up-and-coming names were in the running for the role of Daniel, with Charlie Sheen stating he even turned it down. But in the end, it was Ralph Macchio, largely thanks to his breakout role in The Outsiders, who was cast in the part. William Zabka, an experienced wrestler, was chosen as Johnny Lawrence, with Martin Kove becoming his Cobra Kai sensei John Kreese, who, along with Miyagi, was also a US Army veteran. Neither Macchio nor Zabka had any karate experience, so trained under the film's black belt fight coordinator, Pat Johnson. The climactic battle was considered to be a tough ask for their skill level, so Johnson was cast as the referee to ensure he could keep a close eye on proceedings. During production, not many people involved thought they were making a future classic. Aside from most hating the title, editor Bud Smith remembers it as just a little movie that no one was going to give a about. Macchio thought the script was cheesy and campaigned to call the movie anything else. Most actors' agents told their clients it was just another job, one to be quickly forgotten. But Avildsen kept the faith, as he told a skeptical cast and crew on location, "You guys have no idea what you're making here. This is going to be a classic." The director was, of course, absolutely correct. The Karate Kid wasn't a huge priority for Columbia Pictures prior to release. It had no A-list leads, a modest budget, a director with a recent history of flops, and a script from a relative newcomer. Being labelled as Teenage Karate Rocky pigeonholed it and limited its scope. But gradually, perceptions changed. Execs were blown away by early cuts of the movie, and test screenings went really well. The chemistry between Morita and Macchio, the heartfelt, crowd-pleasing story, the soundtrack, something clicked that the studio hadn't anticipated. It was undeniable. And then the reviews started coming in. A few dismissed it as a Rocky clone, but many loved it. Roger Ebert called it one of the best films of the year and gave it a full 4 stars. To their credit, Columbia responded by increasing the marketing budget, and word of mouth began to spread. In a summer packed with blockbuster heavyweights, one of Hollywood's greatest years ever, suddenly this small, awkwardly titled movie was a real contender. And then, on the 22nd of June 1984, The Karate Kid hit cinemas. It wasn't an instant smash. In fact, it didn't get to higher than 3rd spot in the weekly box office chart across its entire run. But the film soon demonstrated its remarkable staying power. Rather than simply opening and decreasing, takings went up in week 3. It pulled in over $1 million a week at the box office for 4 straight months and remained in theaters right up until the end of the year. The Karate Kid would make over $90 million in its initial North American run and eventually would take in excess of $130 million worldwide in cinemas alone, a massive return on its modest investment. It became the top video rental title of 1985, launched a mini empire of merchandise and video game releases, and would find a second life on the small screen that has never really come to an end. Calling it a cultural phenomenon is perhaps an understatement. Karate and martial arts, becoming increasingly acknowledged in Western culture in the years prior, were everywhere once the movie became a hit. Interest in dojos in suburbs and cities went through the roof, with karate school enrollment doubling in the US in 1985. Hey, even Young Culture Slice did it badly for a couple of years. And watching it back, the movie itself holds up really well. The fact that Macchio in particular wasn't a martial artist adds a scrappy, believable quality to the fight scenes. The romance between him and Shu is genuinely sweet, and the story being entirely predictable is not an issue as it's just delivered so well. The film is cheesy, but in the best way possible. Cobra Kai are the bad guys, but the relationships within it are complex. Johnny has his own arc, even within the first film. You empathize with the antagonist. This became a building block for what would become possibly the most successful movie to TV series transition ever more than 30 years later. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Back in 1984, as well as Bill Conti's excellent score, the soundtrack features at least two truly classic 80s movie tracks in the form of You're the Best and Cruel Summer, and the music overall helps to lift the whole experience. Cruel Summer remains an absolute dance floor banger to this day. I think another undervalued strength of the Karate Kid is how genuinely funny it is. Moments like Daniel turning up to the Halloween dance dressed as a shower always cracked me up as a kid, and Morita's background as a comedian brings just the right amount of levity to Miyagi's scenes. And it's that blend, comedy and depth, which for me elevates the whole film to something very special. Morita's layered, empathetic performance is at the heart of it. His scene of drunken antics manages to be both laugh out loud and full of emotional resonance. The fact that he was nominated for the Academy Award for Best Supporting Actor for a film so many had dismissed as a Rocky knockoff before release shows how strong his work was here. Miyagi became one of the defining characters of 80s cinema because of the tour de force behind him. The performances are universally strong, but in many ways, this is Miyagi's movie. If you can't tell, I really love this film. Avildsen's story in Hollywood, his comeback to not just box office glory, but also his films being celebrated at the Academy Awards, mirrored the against-the-odds nature of the film itself. It became more than just a Rocky clone too. The fact that it told the story of a teenager at a time when audiences were increasingly gaining an appetite for young adult-focused movies allowed it to explore new themes, and the relationship of its two leads and the focus on spirituality decades before mindfulness became cool were really something unique. Avildsen was always the perfect choice for the job too, with his realistic shooting style, his affinity with emotional sincerity, and his history of underdog characters fighting against the odds. It's no wonder that excellent 2017 documentary chronicling his life and work was titled King of the Underdogs. He also wouldn't be making the same Rocky-shaped mistake again and signed up to a sequel as soon as it was clear The Karate Kid was a hit big enough to demand one, and that sequel had been greenlit before the first movie had even left cinemas. By early 1985, The Karate Kid Part 2 was already in production. With Avildsen back, Kamen also returned to write the script, and the studio was keen to strike while the iron was piping hot. Picking up exactly where the first film ended, Part 2 told the story of Miyagi taking Daniel to Okinawa, Japan, to visit his dying father. While Miyagi rekindles things with old flame Yuki, played by Nobu McCarthy, Daniel gets his own new love interest Kumiko, aka Tamlin Tomita, who I distinctly remember Young Culture Slice fancying a lot. Miyagi's return causes issues with not just his former best friend, Danny Kamikona's Sato, but also his nephew Chosen, played by Yuji Okamoto, who soon becomes Daniel's new rival and sets up the inevitable final battle. Needing to create the visuals of rural Japan, the producers instead opted for the more cost-effective approach of building a village in Hawaii. Filming ran between September and December 1985, with the second film now having the weight of expectation of being one of the most anticipated releases of the summer of 1986. Reactions from critics prior to its release were less positive for the sequel. Roger Ebert recommended it again, but Gene Siskel didn't, even if he did say that it was by no means a bad film that featured scattered pleasures throughout. The praise was considered immoderate, but it wasn't exactly being seen as a barnstormer, labelled as stale and boring by some, as the New York Times review summed it up. Even as sequels go in this era of movie megaseries, The Karate Kid Part 2 peters out faster than most. The brand was still hot though, and when the movie landed in cinemas on June 20th, 1986, the general public were ready for action. Opening at number 1 at the box office, something the original never managed, it would remain in top spot for a full month and remain in the top 10 right up until October. Outstripping the first film in North American cinemas, The Karate Kid Part 2 would make more than $150 million domestically and over $130 million worldwide, only outperformed by Top Gun and Crocodile Dundee. In the US and Canada across the entire year, it would end up as the 6th highest grossing movie released in 1986. Given that the success metric at the time for sequels was to achieve 75% of its predecessor, it went beyond expectations. The Karate Kid Part 2 is a really interesting film. It takes some of the cues and story beats of the first movie, but layers them into what is a surprisingly quiet, charming film. The early scenes involving Cobra Kai's seeming dissolution add an interesting layer to proceedings, and, though largely formulaic, it still manages to again pack an emotional thrust kick overall. I enjoyed it quite a lot 40 years on, retaining a surprising amount of impact, and it is for me a worthy sequel. The Glory of Love by Peter Cetera managed to be an even cheesier lead song than You're the Best, but again, it just kind of works. Perhaps unsurprisingly, The Glory of Love had actually originally been written for inclusion in Rocky IV. Now, if you're a regular Sequelpalooza viewer, you might be thinking to yourself at this point, what exactly is going on here? I mean, so far we've covered a successful sequel. If the Karate Kid's 80s and 90s journey would have ended here, everything would have been wrapped up in a nice little package. But this video would not be a Sequelpalooza, so worry not my friends, because almost inevitably, things started to get more than a little messier from here. How many martial arts films of the 80s and 90s owe a debt to the success of The Karate Kid? Well, the answer to that is... well, I don't know the actual answer, but things certainly drastically changed for the genre after Daniel and Miyagi's box office bonanza, because The Karate Kid didn't just make martial arts cool again, it made them marketable, and Hollywood was clearly paying attention. Pretty rapidly, martial arts movies which had a checkered history in Western cinema came crashing back into fashion. Specifically, the underdog martial arts story became its own mini-industry. Cheap to make, these films ranged from shameless knockoffs to more creative efforts just looking to cash in on the moment. Arriving even before Karate Kid 2, No Retreat, No Surrender featured a bullied teen, a wise ghost sensei Bruce Lee, and a final showdown with a Soviet bad guy played by a baby-faced Jean-Claude Van Damme. I am not making this up. There was also Karate Warrior, an Italian mashup of the Karate Kid and Bloodsport, featuring a kid named Olaf mastering the stroke of the dragon. Somehow, it wrapped up 5 sequels in 6 years, officially entering Police Academy territory, just with fewer gags involving hair removal and slightly more dragon strokes. Other films tried to reinvent the formula. Best of the Best went serious and dramatic, with Eric Roberts leading a US team into a high-stakes martial arts showdown, while Only the Strong took a more grounded approach, mixing high school redemption arcs with Brazilian capoeira. One critic called it the kids from Fame armed with very sharp knives. As we moved into the 90s, the focus shifted to younger heroes. Three Ninjas made a splash in cinemas with its mix of Karate Kid and Home Alone, with young culture slice thinking it was pretty awesome at the time too. It also gave us 3 sequels, including the 4th film High Noon at Mega Mountain, which co-starred Hulk Hogan and one of the most ridiculous wigs ever committed to film. Surf Ninjas tried to surf the same wave, with Game Gear time travel, Rob Schneider and an evil Leslie Nielsen. It happened. There was also mystical mentor flicks like Sidekicks, where Jonathan Brandis fought bullies alongside his imaginary friend Chuck Norris, and The Power Within, a deep cut which saw a kid inherit a magic kung fu ring. This one even cast William Zabka to really up the Karate Kid nostalgia factor. And who could forget Nunchuck Summer Hawaiian High Kicks, the 1988 box office smash featuring Tom Selleck as a wise PI sensei teaching a group of young English kids the way of the world and karate during a sun-soaked summer vacation in Maui. Actually, hang on, that didn't actually happen, did it? Moving on. Decades later, you can still trace the film's influence beyond just movies. While researching for this video, I found loads of articles about how MMA fighters found watching The Karate Kid on HBO as kids was their light bulb moment, the thing that pushed them into training. Sadly, I couldn't find any similar testimonials about High Noon at Mega Mountain inspiring careers in combat sports. But, you know, never say never. Cowabunga dudes, and welcome to another episode of Film 89 for our summer movie special. On tonight's show, will Weekend at Bernie's become the definitive movie release of the entire 1980s? Will Turner and Hooch and K9 prove beyond the shadow of a doubt that buddy action comedies featuring a cop and a dog are the future of cinema? And will The Karate Kid Part 3 be the 3rd film in a row from the beloved series to make at least $130 million worldwide? I think we can all agree that the answer to each of these questions will almost certainly end up being a definitive yes. Sorry about that. Just remembering my late 80s glory days again for a second there. Man, my analysis was just as dodgy then as it is now. Anyway, as the 1980s marched on, seemingly endless sequels became an ever-present part of studios' business plans. Inevitably, the first 2 Karate Kid films led Columbia Pictures to very quickly turn their attention to not just a Part 3, but also diversification. And with Part 2 outperforming expectations, Columbia felt the franchise would only get stronger. But in actual fact, this was when the decline set in. Despite almost all the key players returning in front of and behind the camera, the 3rd film would prove so creatively unsuccessful that Avildsen himself would later call the film he directed a horrible imitation of the original. And honestly, he's not too far off. The story beats are so similar that you can almost feel Macchio's disdain through the screen. It's literally a copy and paste of Part 1, just not nearly as good. Daniel reluctantly gets involved in a karate conflict. Miyagi reluctantly trains him for a tournament. Daniel is bullied by a seemingly superior student. The climax is an all-valley tournament. In Macchio's own words, Part 3 felt like we were redoing the first movie as a sort of cartoon, without the heart and soul which sold the original. There's a different Cobra Kai boss in Thomas Ian Griffith, who is easily the most entertaining thing in the film, Sean Kanan as Daniel's dangerous new rival Mike Barnes, and a new kind of love interest companion character played by Robin Lively, who is far more tacked on and irrelevant to the plot than Elizabeth Shue's Ali ever was. Perhaps this isn't totally surprising given that the makers realised the 11-year age gap between 16-year-old Lively and Macchio, who was 27 at the time, made an actual on-screen romance potentially very dodgy, necessitating hasty rewrites. The reviews reflected the creatively bankrupt nature of the franchise by the time of the 3rd go-around. Variety called it a particularly dim-witted film that will likely spell the death of the series, and it was a movie the Washington Post thought was so boring that even the love interest leaves early. It was noted as half-hearted and very dull, whilst the material is wearing out its welcome was a common refrain. When it was released on June 30th, 1989, it was clear that the party, if not completely over, was definitely winding down, making it to third place in an admittedly competitive opening weekend behind Batman and Honey, I Shrunk the Kids. The trilogy of the series showed little of the staying power of its predecessors. Whereas the first two films had grossed $130 million, Part 3 would struggle to make more than $35 million. Not only does this feel like an unnecessary sequel, but it also has elements that take the series backwards. Character growth is ignored for the sake of a retread story. Daniel reverts back to the scared teenager we met in Part 1. It's less a character arc and more a character loop. The attempts to build drama simply don't land, and just adding more fight scenes and action can't cover up for the complete lack of interest delivered by the script. There's a sort of retro campy energy watching it back all these years later, but this is not a good movie. Although I will throw down with anyone who disagrees with the fact that Thomas Ian Griffith is awesome. His performance alone almost makes the whole exercise worthwhile, but not quite. Anyway, 2 months after the release of Part 3, the Karate Kid animated series debuted on NBC on the morning of Saturday, September 9th, 1989. Featuring Morita as Miyagi, the cartoon had originally been set for a longer run a year earlier, but its single series and shortened 13-episode run reflected the increasingly dwindling interest in a franchise which had run its course. It was yesterday's news. In Hollywood though, a defeat is never really the end of the tournament, and by 1994, without any momentum whatsoever, it was time for a reboot. Ralph Macchio acknowledged that his character had gone backwards and the story was becoming cartoonish. He didn't have much interest in a return, although the studio never actually approached him either. Pat Morita was contracted for another film, and Columbia, now owned by Sony, was keen to see what could be resurrected from the wreckage of Part 3. Producer Jerry Weintraub decided to pivot to a female lead in an attempt to refresh the formula, perhaps even appeal to a wider audience whilst also taking a slightly more serious approach than Part 3. The next Karate Kid was starting to take shape.
In search of the right student. A student in need of the right training.
A young Hilary Swank, who had only made her film debut in Buffy the Vampire Slayer a couple of years prior, was plucked from relative obscurity to play the new lead Julie Pierce, a troubled teenage girl reeling from losing both her parents, who is mentored by Miyagi. Together, they also have to deal with an aggressive group known as the Alpha Elite, led by Michael Ironside, with Julie needing to prove her newfound karate and life skills to survive. Wrapping up on-set production across 8 weeks in the summer of 1993, it wouldn't be released for another 12 months. Reviews for that fourth film continued the downward trend of the series. The performances were quite good, but the film around them wasn't. The Baltimore Sun summed up the overall critical viewpoint. This film feels like a desperate attempt to squeeze a few last bucks out of what was once a very obliging cash cow. When the next Karate Kid made it to cinemas on September 9th, 1994, it was clear that interest was at a new low, landing in 7th place in its opening weekend behind all-time classics like Milk Money and Trial by Jury, along with a few genuine classics. It wouldn't even last a month before it disappeared from screens. Making just under $16 million worldwide, it was far and away the least successful movie of the franchise. Even on video, it didn't really find a secondary audience, only maintaining interest thanks to Swank's later career and its connection to the Karate Kid brand. The rebirth for a new generation didn't really go anywhere. The next Karate Kid's heart was in the right place, but it fell down on execution. Perhaps unsurprisingly for a future Oscar winner, Swank makes a pretty engaging lead, and of course Morita is still awesome, but there is a distinct lack of magic, and the whole thing is very mundane. The movie that writer Mark Lee and director Christopher Kane craft is functional, churned out, and less flamboyantly bad than 3, but it is still pretty bad. It's not like there isn't a little bit of wackiness in part 4. There's a random Falcon subplot, some comic relief Buddhist monks, and for some reason the villains this time are Cobra Kai knockoff high school campus security bros. But it's never fully embraced and just ends up feeling weird and tonally awkward. Lee would only write one more film, a made-for-TV effort called Hostage Negotiator, and Kane would go on to direct the likes of The Amazing Panda Adventure and a 1997 comedy called Gone Fishing, which somehow cost $53 million to make and was so bad that star Joe Pesci apparently took to standing outside screenings to give those people who did pay to see it their money back. Not exactly the dream team to revive the Karate Kid franchise, which, by this stage, was on its knees. The key players in front of and behind the camera, who had made it such a valuable brand to begin with, largely struggled to move on too. Macchio couldn't escape the Daniel LaRusso image in Hollywood, and largely took on indie films, theatre roles and TV show cameos following 1992's My Cousin Vinny. Zabka played the obnoxious jock in more 80s movies like Back to School and Just One of the Guys before transitioning away from mainstream films. After getting into producing and directing, he was nominated for a Best Short Film Oscar in 2004. Writer Kamen bucked the trend, becoming a recurring collaborator with Luc Besson across The Fifth Element as well as the Taken and Transporter franchises. Original director Avildsen would never hit the same heights again. He returned for Rocky V in 1990, but the magic was gone, and his last film would come in 1999 with the Van Damme action flick Inferno. He passed away in 2017 at the age of 81. As for Pat Morita, Miyagi was both a blessing and a curse. He was often typecast in similar roles and rarely got the chance to lead in major projects again. Still, despite personal and health challenges, he continued to work consistently right up until his passing in 2005. For the Karate Kid brand itself, the best part of 2 decades would pass before we would see its name resurface in cinemas. The 2010 reboot, directed by Harold Zwart, wasn't actually meant to be a straight remake, swapping out karate for kung fu and California for China. Produced by Will Smith as a star vehicle for his son Jaden, the film paired him with the legend himself Jackie Chan as the Mr. Miyagi-esque mentor. The story followed Dre Parker, a 12-year-old uprooted from Detroit to Beijing, who, much like Daniel, struggles to fit in before being trained in kung fu by a quiet, grief-stricken maintenance man. All very familiar, and it's certainly slicker than the original, but it felt like a somewhat pointless retread to me at the time, and confusingly titled given the focus is a totally different martial art. Maybe it's just me, but I remember this film as a bit of a disaster. A meaningless retread built on nepotism, directed by the guy who had last made the Pink Panther 2. But, based on reviews and box office takings, that wasn't the case. I mean, the nepotism part would eventually ring true for Smith, spelled out by a very genuine cinematic mess a few years later that steamrolled his career as a Hollywood headliner, but looking back now, the 5th Karate Kid film was a hit and received well at the time. It made over $350 million on a $40 million budget, the majority of reviews were positive, and there had been plans to make a sequel to the sequel pretty much from the beginning. In the end, that didn't happen of course. Script and scheduling issues delayed things before After Earth became such a notorious failure that another movie with the same cast was never going to happen, and Studio Sony and the wider movie business's priorities shifted. If this had been titled The Kung Fu Kid as originally planned and been positioned as a homage to the original with a brand new story and martial arts element, then maybe it would have lasted longer in the zeitgeist. But Hollywood was soon putting all its eggs in the superhero basket and we never saw a follow-up. I wasn't gagging for another film by this stage anyway, but that's by the by I guess. Either way, the 2010 film seems largely forgotten now, and it appeared like it was finally time to accept defeat for the franchise as a whole. 5 films, spin-offs and video games had been delivered, hit soundtracks and a cultural legacy. It had had a long, and more importantly for Hollywood, largely profitable run. Time to hang up the headband and live a life of peace, right? Well, not quite. By 2018, a brand new contender had entered the tournament. and this one would end up changing the game completely, even if that seemed unlikely initially. The final resurgence of the Karate Kid brand wouldn't have anything to do with cinema releases at all. Originally arriving as a YouTube Red exclusive, Cobra Kai was created by writers, directors, producers and Karate Kid superfans Josh Heald, John Hurwitz and Hayden Schlossberg as an opportunity to pick up the story 34 years on from the 1984 All Valley Karate Tournament. Bringing back both Ralph Macchio as Daniel LaRusso and William Zabka as Johnny Lawrence, the show smartly flipped the original dynamic on its head, exploring their adult lives decades later. It also introduced a new generation of students, blending legacy and fresh blood to great effect. Numerous faces from across the movies made appearances, and the series embraced the history of what had come before it, whilst also creating something valuable and unique. It was rough and ready in places, but Cobra Kai soon became a surprise breakout hit with fans and critics. And when YouTube scaled back their original drama strategy in 2020, Netflix swooped in to pick up Series 3. I get that some complain about it being cheesy, while some have said it leaned too heavily into comedy, or that it's little more than the OC with karate, but well, I liked the OC, I don't agree, and surely from a purely objective perspective, it's fair to call Cobra Kai a triumph at this stage, isn't it? Not only was it a word of mouth hit on YouTube, but it has since achieved enormous viewing numbers on Netflix, and critical analysis was pretty much universally positive too. It reinvigorated the careers of Macchio and Zabka in particular, taking them from recognizable 80s names to legitimate current mainstream stars, and it kind of did exactly the same thing for the Karate Kid brand. Netflix data showed that the premiere episode of the climactic season 6 achieved over 1 billion minutes of viewing in its first week on release. Crazy numbers for what was seen as a novelty nostalgia trip at first. And they're numbers that I'd be happy to emulate on my videos, so algorithm, if you're listening, you know what to do. Anyway, back in reality. Macchio and Zabka were suddenly stars and exec producers of one of the hottest shows in the world. Macchio has reflected on this, how Cobra Kai has brought the Karate Kid to a whole new generation. How now, it's not just the 40-something parents, but also their kids who stop him in the streets. Sometimes I use the word stupid when talking about Cobra Kai, because it's just stupid how successful it's become. We've had such a warm embrace from close to 4 generations. And it is that generation crossover which wouldn't have been possible if that first movie hadn't have ended up such an undeniable banger. Despite numerous bumps along the way, John Avildsen himself couldn't have crafted a better story of underdog victory against the odds than Cobra Kai finally giving the kid the glorious happy ending it always deserved. Although right now, as we head into the summer of 2025, we're just about to see the writing of a brand new chapter unfold. The Karate Kid is just one of those movies. I must have seen it 100 times, but still, for this video, I watched it again without a second thought. It's almost like there were 2 phases in the lives of a generation, before the Karate Kid and after. It was, for what it was, a pretty perfect film. If someone had tried to make it 1,000 times over, none would have had the same impact. Something that made following up tough, even if its box office success meant that sequels were inevitable. I thought they actually made a decent fist of it with part 2, but some of the follow-ups and reboots left a lot to be desired. And really, the franchise has Cobra Kai, once a weird little YouTube Red experiment, to thank for its modern day renaissance. The genius of that show was that it didn't just understand what made the original movie connect, it respected it and then went further. Instead of just relying on nostalgia hits, it actually built something meaningful on top of the foundation. It could have easily been a shallow cash-in, but it wasn't, and that gave it real impact. Cobra Kai explored backstories and character depth in a way we have rarely seen before in similar projects. After spending almost a year so far making a series about Hollywood's often tumultuous relationships with sequels and reboots, I just wish more big screen follow-ups had the imagination, care and originality of the small screen Cobra Kai. A reboot film could have subverted expectations back in the 90s too, but instead we got goofy villains and lazy retreads. And make no mistake, things were pretty rough in the late 80s and early 90s. Cobra Kai became a real turning point for the brand. When it launched, the franchise had become something of a punchline, but the original film's concept, the relatable story, the iconic performances, the confident direction, and yes, that killer soundtrack meant it always had a shot at a comeback in the right hands. And now, 15 years on from the last cinematic reboot, we're just about to get another Karate Kid movie in cinemas. Bridging both the big and small screen worlds, the film features Ralph Macchio and Jackie Chan, with Ben Wang stepping in as the new lead. With any luck, it will take lessons from both the triumphs and missteps of the Miyagi-verse that came before. If Legends proves profitable, then it sounds like a Cobra Kai movie could be not too far behind. The show's finale left things open-ended enough for another chapter to be written. And if there's one thing this franchise has taught us, it's that if it makes money, or even might make money, then there will be more. As unlikely as it looked after the Karate Kid 3, or the next Karate Kid, this is a franchise that has endured the test of time. And now, in some form or another, the Karate Kid might actually live on forever. The Karate Kid is a film so beloved and iconic that it continued to wipe away the cinematic sins of its sequels from people's memories for decades. But that kind of legacy is rare, and in the next full-length Culture Slice documentary, we'll be heading to the complete opposite end of the spectrum. Lost comedies of the 1990s will be arriving on the channel in June, charting the course of 4 light-hearted 90s releases that either didn't live up to the hype or weren't able to even generate any hype at all. Thanks so much for continuing to support Culture Slice's journey. It genuinely means the world. You're the best around, and nothing's ever gonna keep you down. We recently passed 3,500 subs and 200,000 views, and we'll keep rolling on the road to 4,000 subscribers with more Sequelpaloozas, Lost Blockbusters, and a whole host of other goodness from the Culture Slice time machine. There's a lot more to be announced for the channel, or is that channels, very soon. Wait, 2 channels? That's right, we've recently launched Culture Slice Cuts, our home for trailers, bonus content, highlights from the main videos, and sliced cut shorts, which are basically just like our long-form documentaries, just much faster. The preview trailer for this very video dropped on Cuts a full 2 weeks before the episode, and we'll be releasing a video explaining how you can help shape a future Culture Slice doc over there next week too. If you think that all that sounds cool, then you can check it out via the link in the description. And thanks very much for any and all views and subscribes for Culture Slice Cuts.
I just want to say thank you.
And on that note, take care of yourselves, paint the fence, and of course, save Ferris.